Здравствуйте, коллеги. Hello, colleagues. My name is John Morgan of the School of Education at the University of Nottingham. Together with my colleague Grigori Kliucharev of the Institute of Sociology at the Russian Academy of Sciences, I recently guest edited a special issue of the European Journal of Education on Russian higher education and the post-Soviet transition. Winston Churchill once said that Russia was a mystery wrapped in an enigma, and to a great extent that aphorism remains true. It is over 20 years since the end of the Soviet Union, and yet we know relatively little of the detail of the process of transition that has since taken place in that great country. The Soviet education system in general, and higher education in particular, maintained a balance between two poles, egalitarian and elite. The first was more or less accessible for millions of ordinary people, mostly secondary school graduates, though standards and quality were not very high. The second was definitely of high quality, but had very limited access, apart from the children of the ruling Communist Party nomenclatura and the local elite families, the latter being especially prominent in the non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union. However, the huge labour demands of a centrally planned economy, the vast amount of natural resources, and the comparative isolation from a competitive world economy induced a complacency in the Soviet system of education, which was driven ideologically and met the political and economic demands of a command society and economy. As a result, the education system and its theories and practices remained frozen internally and impervious to outside influences, which, if anything, were seen as threatening. This changed dramatically with the end of the Soviet Union. As with all other Soviet institutions, the system of education has been required to readjust if it is to survive in the new Russian conditions. It has been faced above all with the need to identify a new social and economic role as the education system of a new Russia. This raised fundamental questions that required urgent answer, and it is these that we seek to address in the special issue. What was its purpose? Who should it serve? How was it to be organized and financed? In the special issue, we focus on the responses of that most crucial and yet vulnerable part of the system, higher education, including professional and vocational training. The emergence of a demographic hole during the 1990s made these questions even more difficult to answer, especially on a long-term basis. However, it is worth mentioning that under the conditions of an officially approved transition to a market economy, the latter sectors proved very sensitive to the new economic labour market demands. After the shock of the 1990s, the period since 2000 has been one of relative stability in Russian society and economy. This has been true also of the education system, including higher education. Yet Russia remains a society and an economy in transition, but there is now a sense of national recovery and direction. The policy of innovative modernization announced by the leadership of Vladimir Putin and of Dmitry Medvedev, and now of Putin again, stimulated a demand for highly qualified personnel. This challenged Russian universities and other related institutions to achieve a high level of professional education and vocational training. The emphasis was now primarily on human capital development, rather than on the more traditional cultural and academic or scientific missions of higher education. Yet it has also had the effect of creating a new generation of Russian graduates, some of whom are claiming to have a greater say in the government of their country than they have had hitherto. The recent demonstrations in Russian cities, particularly in Moscow, are an evidence of that. Yet the core of the modernization policy, as it concerned higher education, remains essentially one which focused on access, quality and efficiency. The aim was and remains the gradual but steady construction of a modern system of higher education, including professional education, vocational training and adult continuing education. One of the main problems of Russian higher education today is still the relatively small number of graduates who find employment that matches their qualification. Again, the statistical information varies considerably, depending on the source. However, at present, around 40% of Russian students remain unemployed on graduation, a situation aggravated by low salaries. It is worth noting that the transformation of education in Russia is, like elsewhere, a very sensitive matter, with education seen as a social elevator, giving one the chance of improving one's life chances. The most crucial issue in the current economic and political climate is how to share the costs of education between the state and the learners. It is a real and painful social transition from the Soviet period, when education was free for the individual citizen and supplemented by central government or municipal subsidies. The dependency culture of that era is still a strong challenge to contemporary Russian society. And what is more challenging is that the education system is reproducing and widening social economic inequalities. Another question is whether Russian education is sustaining a cohesive Russian identity, together with intercultural and intergenerational dialogue. So, Russian higher education is experiencing a radical transformation, brought about by both internal social and economic needs and by the external pressures of Europeanization and globalization. The former has been a feature of Russian higher education to a lesser or greater degree throughout its history, but it is now intensified by the further pressure of globalization on a Russia that is still in a process of profound transition. This situation, not unexpectedly, encourages the persistence of conservative attitudes, which are resilient and should not be assumed to be without merit. The articles collected in the special issue consider these problems in detail, with a special focus on Russian higher education in Europe. They are written by leading Russian academics, or by academics who have had an extensive engagement with Russian higher education and scholarly collaboration with Russian colleagues, in some cases extending to the Soviet as well as the post-Soviet period. The articles are based on both original research in Russia and an extensive review of relevant primary and secondary literature in Russian as well as that of other European languages, particularly English and German. I hope you will find the special issue of great interest, and I look forward perhaps to a dialogue with you about its contents. My email address is john.morgan@nottingham.ac.uk. Spasibo vam, thank you, and do svidaniya. Goodbye.